This is your reality check.
Welcome to The Reality Check, the weekly Canadian show that explores a wide range of controversies and curiosities using science and critical thinking. Today is May 24th, 2020. I'm producer Pat, and it's just me as the panelist still recording solo from isolation. We have two interesting segments for you today. Both are recent news stories. Adam tackles headlines suggesting that despite coronavirus fears, cruise ship bookings are way up. But before that, Christina and I had a conversation with friend of the show, Dr. Stuart Robbins, about recent reports that NASA has discovered a parallel universe where time runs backwards. Stuart is a research scientist who studies planetary geophysics. I hope you enjoyed both segments and that everyone is staying healthy and sane out there, and we'll talk to you soon.
Welcome back to the show, Dr. Stuart Robbins. Always a pleasure to have you back, as we always call you the fifth Beatle. How are you, Stuart?
I'm living the dream. And how are you up in cold Canada?
Yeah.
Not so cold here.
We're in my shorts and tank top right now. So, Stuart, I reached out to you a couple of days ago because Darren posted a link in TRC's group chat to an article titled, NASA Finds Evidence of Parallel Universe Where Time Runs Backward.
What a troublemaker.
Yes, he is. We were all scratching our heads about it, and then since then, the news has blown up on the interwebs with various people chiming in. But when I first brought it to your attention, it took you down quite the rabbit hole. So, Stuart, tell us, did a NASA particle detector experiment really discover a parallel universe where time runs backward? Please say yes.
All right. Well, so I will talk about the rabbit hole first then, because yes, you messaged me this and I got it after I'd made dinner. And while I was eating dinner, I went down this rabbit hole. And the first thing was, I thought, have I heard of this? And my second thought was, no, I haven't. Therefore, it's probably not real. And I know that that's going to sound really arrogant to some people, but it's a case where if you are embedded in your field and you happen to read a lot of news like I do, that's both general as well as field specific, it would be really weird if a major discovery like this hadn't been seen or hadn't made any headlines in anything that I'd read, or even on Facebook, because I'm Facebook friends with about 100 people who are in my field and who do this kind of work. And the fact that they weren't talking about it meant that something was a little weird here.
Right, contrary to the black hole, quote-unquote, photo we saw, that was
exactly
where, all over the news.
That was a case where I think there's a cartoon that likes to make the rounds where it's a person at a computer waking up in the morning, clicks to open the internet, and then suddenly like a bajillion images of the black hole pop out of the monitor. That would have happened if something like this were real. And that didn't happen here.
So that's our first clue that this is probably not true.
Right. You basically ask an expert, and have they heard about it? And if the answer is no, then already your skepticism should be tingling. So what I did was I basically went to the news story that you sent me to, which is from the New York Post, which was posted that day. The title was, NASA Scientists Detect Evidence of Parallel Universe Where Time Runs Backwards. Or backward, sorry, there's no S at the end. And basically, I only was looking for an original source. So that linked me to something called the Daily Star, where the title was, NASA Scientists Detect Parallel Universe, quote, next to ours, where time runs backwards, with an S at the end. That was from a few days earlier, and it had 1.2 million shares when I was looking at it.
Wow.
So I was still reading that, looking for an original source. There was none. So what they linked to was an article from New Scientist from April 8th of 2020. So that was over a month earlier, which is another kind of click in the skeptisense where it's like, well, wait a minute. Why is this story suddenly getting traction on these sort of side news sites? I mean, I had never really heard of Daily Star. I think I might have heard of New York Post. And why is it referencing an article in another place that's over a month old?
Well, and also New York Post has a questionable reputation as well, as many people know, right?
Right. Well, and the other thing is Daily Star. So I have a crazy firewall on my computer. It's a program called Little Snitch. I actually do recommend it if you're willing to put up with it. It lets me block things at not only the application level, but the URL, the domain, and the port level. So basically, whenever my computer, when any application tries to connect to anything, I get an alert if I haven't previously allowed it to happen. And when I was loading Daily Star, it was trying to load content from the Daily Mail. The Daily Mail is a very well-known British tabloid along the lines of Weekly World News. This is really highly questionable if you outright know that it's fake when you look at it. So the fact that Daily Star was trying to load content from that was another red flag. So I went to this New Scientist article from April 8th titled, "We may," the first questionable word, "we may have spotted a parallel universe going backwards in time." Problem with New Scientist is that they are behind a paywall. So all they do is let you read the tantalizing first paragraph or 2 or 3, it depends, and that's it. And so there was absolutely nothing in there that I could look for in terms of an original source from New Scientist. Now, New Scientist was linking to a couple of their own articles that were behind their own paywalls that went back further and further in time. So it was a case where at that point it was almost kind of a dead end. So I went back to the Daily Star as well as the New York Post and tried to find the scientist involved, so maybe I could look for them. So I did. The guy's last name is Gorham, Gorham. He is an actual real person, so it wasn't something totally made up. He's an experimental particle physicist at the University of Hawaii, and both of those articles quoted him as saying, "Not everyone was comfortable with the hypothesis." And then they both attributed this to New Scientist, saying he told New Scientist. So this is a case where basically it seemed like everyone was copying and pasting from the same original article in the beginning of April, and I have no idea what he was actually responding to when he said that, because we all know that whether it's intentional or not, the news media does tend to quote mine, which is where you pick out something somebody said and use it in whatever context you want. So I wanted to search for that first author. What I did was I searched the Googles and I searched for his name. I searched for neutrinos because at this point I knew that it had something to do with neutrinos. And I searched for parallel universe. I searched for weird results. I searched for Antarctica because this was an experiment that had been done in Antarctica. And what I was turning up was stuff from 2018. So that's another red flag. If your chain of custody has these gigantic gaps in it, in terms of we have suddenly some questionable news sources from now linking to an article that's over 2 months old, or over a month old at the time, and then that was linking to or referring to stuff that apparently was 2 years old, that leads me to really question what's going on. So for me, I was thinking, okay, maybe this was a result, or it was data that was published in 2018 that has been reinterpreted by somebody else. So what I did was I wanted to figure out who that somebody else was. Unfortunately, none of these news sources were actually telling me what the latest paper was that was saying anything. So what I did was I went to something called ADS in astronomy. It's the Astrophysics Data System, which is basically a search engine for papers in the astrophysics, very broad sense astrophysics community. So it covers physics, it covers theoretical physics, cosmology, astronomy, as well as planetary science. So I used this and I searched for his name. And the only thing I could find that was relevant was from 2018. So ADS also has a nice feature where you can click on what papers have cited this paper. So I did that. And a nice thing about ADS besides that is that it will tell you papers that are also not peer-reviewed. So conference abstracts, those kinds of things will also appear in this search. And I was again looking for anything that was obvious, and I found absolutely nothing. So then what I did was I was looking more at these, I guess, derivative news sources, so the ones that you had linked, and I was looking for anything else that would tell me what was cueing this most recent thing. So a phrase that came up that was common was, quote, a Cornell University paper describing the odd phenomenon. So to anyone who's not deeply embedded in the astrophysics, again, very broad language community, would not blink twice at that phrase. I did. And the reason is that Cornell University, many, many years ago, started up what is called a preprint server. And that preprint server is called archive.org. And that is spelled AR capital X, lowercase IV.org. And the reason that it's a capital X is that it's the Greek letter chi, so that's why it's called archive.
Archive.
It's very clever. So they started this up decades ago, and basically you can submit anything you want to that service and it will appear. And that does not mean that it's peer-reviewed. Oftentimes people in the field will submit it to archive before submitting it or concurrently while submitting it to peer review, and then update the paper as they revise it, and it goes through the process and then link to the final journal article. So when I hear or when I read someone saying a Cornell University paper, I'm thinking, okay, it's on archive. So I go to archive. I look for this guy's name again, and again I find nothing recent. So at that point, I kind of hit a brick wall, and I messaged you and said, here's the rabbit hole I went down. Much ado about nothing, but it might be interesting to talk about the rabbit hole.
Well, it was pretty funny because we had that exchange, and then the next time I looked at my chat, it was just full of you literally going down this rabbit hole lifetime. So where did that lead you? That
led me to go to sleep. And when I woke up in the morning, in our group message, you, myself, and Pat had linked to a CNET article.
Yes.
And the CNET article basically had reached the same conclusion that I had. And they also mentioned twice that the New Scientist article was behind a paywall. And they were kind of annoyed about that.
Yeah.
And then I made my first blog post in 2 years, yay, and wrote this up.
You're welcome.
Yes, thank you. I think my readers thank you. So I was just like, this is kind of crazy. The CNET article was entitled, No, NASA didn't find evidence of a parallel universe where time runs backward. So we were figuring out a time to record this. And then the next day, I went into work and was not paying any attention to the news because I was transferring terabytes of data and cleaning out food and other things. I hadn't been into the office in 2 months. And I suddenly get a message, or I get an email that there is a message from Pat, and he writes down that Phil Plait, the bad astronomer, has also now blogged about this.
Mm-hmm.
And Phil has a much larger audience than I think either of us do. And he actually had someone who was able to dig up the paper that had made reference to this thing that was causing all the hubbub.
Right. And I'm going to link to his article as well in the show notes for everybody.
All right, good. So I recommend folks click on that and go to it because it provides an interesting take on it. And it is on archive, this paper. And this paper is from April 11th of 2018.
Oh.
Ah.
So I'm kind of again at a point where I don't know what caused New Scientist to go after this on April 7th of 2020. And I further don't know what caused all of this stuff to just happen now at the end of May. It doesn't make sense. I mean, I haven't found anything where this article is actually published. Like maybe the idea was that it was just published in the peer-reviewed literature, just accepted somewhere. But I actually don't see any evidence of that. But I guess perhaps your listeners might be briefly interested in what sparked the idea?
Yes.
All right. So this has to do with neutrinos. A neutrino is a fundamental particle. As far as we know, it can't really be broken down further. Neutrinos for a very long time were thought to have zero mass, which made things really weird. We later found out in the 90s, actually, that neutrinos do have mass. Neutrinos come in 3 different types. We call them flavors. You can't lick them, no. But they are just called flavors. And the heaviest one is the tau neutrino. What this observation was from an airborne radio telescope, or radio detector, actually, in Antarctica. So during the summer in Antarctica, there are a lot of experiments that are balloon-borne. So basically, you can fill a ginormous, like football-sized, a hot air balloon, basically, with helium, and launch your instrument, and it will basically circle Antarctica for months without you doing anything, collecting data. And it's a really nice way to get high above Earth's atmosphere and do stuff that requires that kind of thing. When I say high above Earth's atmosphere, I actually mean above most of Earth's atmosphere. You're still within the atmosphere. So this experiment in particular was called ANITA. It's not that important what it stands for. It's just another one of those acronyms. And it was searching for evidence of neutrinos. And it was doing this by basically having an array of radio wave detectors. So what happens is that these neutrinos, when they either interact with our atmosphere or interact with ice, and once they've made it through the atmosphere or through Earth itself, because neutrinos, a nice thing about neutrinos is they can pass through almost anything. There are literally more than trillions passing through your body right now, and nothing is going on. They don't like to interact with things. But there are so many of them streaming about that they occasionally do interact with stuff. And when they interact with something in the atmosphere, they can release a burst of other particles, and those can also release radio waves. When they make it through the atmosphere and interact with ice, they can also release a stream of other particles, including radio waves. And so what ANITA, this experiment, was doing was it was searching for these radio waves, and it could find the direction of those radio waves. So it expected to find stuff coming in from outer space, from up, basically. It did not expect to find evidence for the tau neutrino coming up through the Earth and interacting with stuff, because even though other neutrinos can go through Earth really easily, the tau neutrino is the heaviest, and it has the most energy, and it actually can't really make it through Earth without interacting with something else. The way that they knew that it was the tau neutrino and not a different flavor of neutrinos is that the tau neutrino has a specific energy level. Other neutrinos also have a specific energy level. That means that when they interact with something, then those particles that are released can't have more energy than the energy that came in, than the energy from that original tau neutrino. And so every single interaction has its own thumbprint, effectively. So you put all of those different pieces together, and you basically come to the situation where what they found was they found evidence of tau neutrinos coming up instead of coming down. And there are lots of different explanations for this. At the time, it was kind of like, wow, we have this really weird result because we don't think that we should be able to see tau neutrinos coming up because they shouldn't make it through Earth.
And to be clear, Stuart, it is weird, right? It is
interesting.
Weird. Yeah.
Yeah, no, so lots and lots and lots of different possibilities have been raised. So when I was searching ADS for the citations to this article, I found over 50 of them. So in 2 years, having 50 different papers cite your work, at least in my field, that's pretty impressive. And that would be a very high impact article. So it's people who are citing this and saying, what's going on? Well, here is my idea of what's going on. So some people have said this is some evidence for a particular type of dark matter. Some people have said this is evidence for weird reflectors in the ice for neutrinos, and so what they thought was coming up was actually coming from space and just reflected really weirdly in the ice, and they had recommended in their paper to do some sort of radar sounding initially to look for those reflectors in the ice, to see if that could explain the interaction. Phil Plait, in his blog post, raised the point of, you remember almost a decade ago now when the Large Hadron Collider run by CERN announced that they had discovered faster-than-light neutrinos. That made headlines immediately, and the resolution to that, which did not make headlines immediately, was that there was literally a loose cable. So it is entirely possible that it is something really mundane like that with this experiment, with this ANITA experiment, that there was a loose cable. Now, it might not be a loose cable. It could be that maybe they had literally a wire crossed, so what they thought was coming from up was coming from down. Because if you look at pictures of this, it has radio detectors all over this because you have to be able to detect the directionality. So literally, you could have a wire crossed. I'm not saying that's what happened, but that's a possibility. It is an interesting observation, but it also has a lot of potential interesting explanations. One of those explanations is potentially there is a mirror universe where time runs backwards. And this idea was published 2 years ago and is, for some odd reason, now making the rounds. But, as Phil Plait obviously points out in his article that people will point to, or that you will point to, it is really the case where in science we need to try to explain it with really the simple stuff first, the stuff that fits in with our normal everyday experience. And a pseudoscientist listening to this might think, well, why? Why don't you go for the crazy explanation first? Why not think, quote unquote, outside the box? The reason is that the vast majority of the time, the explanation is the mundane one. It's not the one that's way outside the box. So it makes more sense to take time and energy and resources to explore the more mundane explanations before we go searching for the out-of-the-box explanations or the fringe explanations, or, as another podcast likes to say, beyond the mainstream explanations.
Well, as always, Stuart, I love that you're arm's length whenever we have this type of question or mystery, and really appreciate you coming on.
Happy to help, and glad to be on the show.
What's up, cuboids? We're in the midst of a pandemic. COVID-19 is a threat around the globe, and one of the early places where this deadly virus spread was on cruise ships. The Diamond Princess cruise ship was quarantined for over a month. Over 700 people on the ship became infected with COVID-19, and 14 people died from it. Over 40 cruise ships have had confirmed cases of COVID-19, and cruise ships in general are notorious for spreading communicable diseases of all kinds. So how is it that headline after headline are telling us that cruise ship bookings are soaring? Some choice headlines from the Daily Mail. Carnival cruise bookings up 600% after announcing voyages would restart in August. From The Sun. What are they thinking? Carnival Cruises sales up 600% in 3 days after August return date despite coronavirus fears. The New York Post. Carnival swamped with cruise bookings after announcing August return. And here in Canada, Global News had the following headline. Cruise ship bookings jump 600% as Carnival reveals plans to resume trips in August. What's wrong with people, you might ask? I ask a different question. What's wrong with the media? So first, let's just consider the plausibility of the claim. Is it even possible? Now, I think the default assumption that COVID-19 would negatively affect the cruise industry, potentially for years to come, is reasonable. One might expect that customers would reasonably be hesitant to book a cruise, let alone eat in a restaurant or sit in a movie theater, at least until a vaccine is available, or even after that, if some concerns might persist. I can offer two potential reasons for which it might be plausible that cruise sales would go up, but I do not pretend that these are actually strong enough forces to explain a trend, but this might help lend plausibility to it. Now, the first I will explain with a short story. I love A&W. This is a fast food burger chain, and I'm a big fan of their signature teen burger and their onion rings. Now, there's A&W in the States, and there's some in Canada. I believe these are separate franchises that split in the 70s, so they might not have the exact same products there as we have here. The closest A&W restaurant to my place of employment is in Ottawa, in a food court at the Saint Laurent Mall. One day in 2015, this particular location made a lot of press because there was a health violation there. There were cockroaches in the kitchen, and they received warnings and eventually were shut down until they got the infestation under control. Every time I heard one of these stories, my reaction was immediate. I really wanted to eat some A&W. A few days later, I went to the food court and the A&W was closed because of the roach infestation. I came back a couple of days later and I bought myself a teen burger and some onion rings, and it was delicious. Now, is it possible that, for some people, all of this press about devastating situations on cruise ships makes them think about cruise ships and makes them think that that might be a good idea or makes them want to book a cruise? Maybe that's true, but that said, there weren't a lot of other people in line at that A&W that one day. My second idea is a little more political. We live in very polarized times. This whole lockdown and quarantine issue has a lot of people rebelling against suggested safety measures. Some people seem convinced this whole thing is just exaggerated and there's nothing to worry about. and they may be going out of their way to engage in what some people are claiming to be dangerous behavior. Now, this is silly, of course, given the body count on cruise ships, but people are not always that rational. Now, again, I'm not suggesting that this is necessarily a strong enough motivation which could lead to a real increase in demand. I'm just presenting this as a possible scenario, so you can make ideas and speculate as to what this might be, but you need data to back it up. So the real question is, are those cruise bookings really up? Because what I think is really happening is that it's not really true, and that they aren't actually booking cruises in record numbers. A lot of these articles point to the 600% number, and this all traces back to a single source, and that is an article on TMZ, or as we say here in Canada, TMZ. The headline on the site reads, Carnival Cruises bookings surge. Travelers want to hit the seas ASAP, or ASAP, I guess as the kids say these days. This information comes from a rep with Cruise Planners, an American Express travel representative travel franchise. It should be noted that these aren't actual Carnival cruise booking numbers, but those from a travel company which books cruises for Carnival. It's not unreasonable to use this data to infer something about actual Carnival bookings, but that needs to be specified. There may be other reasons for which bookings are up for that particular company. Basically, what happened was that Carnival had just announced that they would be resuming some cruises in August of 2020. In the 3 days following that announcement, the Cruise Planners bookings for Carnival cruises went up 600%. Now, a 600% increase is a fancy way of saying there were 7 times more bookings. So, what's the baseline they're comparing that to? It was the 3 days after the announcement as compared to the 3 days before the announcement. Well, of course, you have a lot of people booking for cruises which you couldn't actually book 3 days earlier. Prior to this announcement, people were likely only booking cruises in the longer term, and they had no assurance that any of those cruises would necessarily take place. They didn't know when business would start back up. Naturally, when August cruises were announced, there would be a big bump in bookings. Further, we've just had a very long period in which people have not been booking many cruises, so that baseline simply does not make sense. So what would be a better metric to compare it to? One would be to use the numbers from the previous year. And in this case, there was a 200% increase over that same time period in 2019, so those same 3 days 1 year earlier. A 200% increase is a fancy way of saying triple, but again, this shouldn't be all that surprising. In 2019, there would have been a slow and steady amount of bookings for cruises throughout the months of February, March, April, and then May. In 2020, you would have had bookings slow down and eventually stop completely throughout the month of March and through all of April. That 200% increase could simply be people who would have booked earlier if they'd been able to book cruises that were available in August. We don't know what kind of numbers we're talking about. If we're dealing with very small numbers, we can expect a lot of variation over a few days. We could 1 to 7 is a 600% increase. It's probably not that small, but that gives you an idea. We didn't get any specifics, likely because the person who's leaking these numbers has an ulterior motive of some kind. Now, a person would be able to tell how well the cruise industry is doing by comparing just how many total bookings a ship might get. But with many cruise lines running less ships this year, this isn't a comparison a person could easily make. We wouldn't even be able to say if cruises are selling out because there may just be less ships running. Now, these were stories from May, which were very recent, but there were other stories making the rounds in April, which similarly were based on bad information. When discussing this segment, producer Pat brought an article about the topic to my attention. A lot of similar articles were claiming increases in bookings by 40%, but this was not an accurate metric. In this case, it was related to cruises in 2021 when things would presumably have settled down quite a bit. That number actually referred to a change in the type of bookings being made. In this case, people were booking cruises for later in the future than they would have previously, which absolutely makes sense. So an increase in booking for cruises further out. Overall, bookings were said to be down 23%. So considering this, it's unlikely cruise bookings really are increasing in a reasonable way, which affects their bottom line. Another thing to consider in these particular cases is that a lot of these far-off bookings were just people who had cruises booked in the next few months that were canceled, who are rebooking cruises further in the future. So it's the same money that they already would have paid. They have to just rebook. So these aren't really new sales. Now, I don't know about the surge in August bookings I mentioned earlier. It's possible that part of that number could also be due to people rebooking canceled cruises from an earlier period in which they weren't able to travel. But there are a lot of potential reasons for that short-term increase in bookings. So what other indications could we have on how the cruise industry is doing? Well, we can look at some indirect metrics. Last week, Carnival Corp announced considerable layoffs, furloughs, which is a temporary suspension of employment, and pay cuts. The furloughs are expected to last up to 6 months. Carnival's UK division similarly is planning pay cuts and layoffs in the coming months. For sure, some of this can be attributed to the fact that no cruises are currently running. But in April, Carnival CEO Arnold Donald stated that the company had enough money to survive a year with no revenues. If business really was promising and booming for August cruises, laying off and suspending staff would not be the best way to respond to an upcoming increase in paying passengers. The reasonable assumption, of course, is that sales are not up at all. They are likely down quite a bit, and they will likely be down for some time. Cruise ship bookings are not booming or surging or whatever some headlines may claim. The numbers stated can be true even if this business is suffering major losses of revenue. I don't know precisely how well or how poorly these companies are doing, but all things considered, it is implausible that the cruise industry is looking at a profitable fall following a loss of public confidence in cruises due to negative press surrounding COVID-19 outbreaks on many ships. Since cruise ships are popular amongst older tourists who are at an increased risk of contracting, transmitting, and dying of COVID-19, I would suggest against booking a cruise until a vaccine is available. But what do I know? I'm not really a cruise guy. I'd rather stay on solid ground and eat a nice A&W teen burger. Peace out, cuboids.
For show notes or to discuss this episode, visit our Facebook page and website at trcpodcast.com. For general inquiries or to send a topic or parody suggestion, email info@trcpodcast.com. Help support the show by leaving a review on iTunes and liking us on Facebook. Follow us on Twitter at TRC_podcast.
Outtakes.
I gave birth to Alien, and Billy Joe Bob Alien is light years away and not paying me no child support. That's that kind of level.